Good evening, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for being here, coming to listen to what I have to say. I think the only time I've ever taken part in a debate in my life was here at the Oxford Union a few years ago. And I'm not debating kind of material. I don't know about that sort of stuff really well. The only times I had debates really were in interrogations with lights and guns pointed towards me, FBI, CIA, MI5 agents questioning me and threatening to send me to Syria or Egypt if I failed to cooperate. And I found myself at a debate at the Oxford Union, which was entitled, "Can torture ever be justified?" There were four on either side, as you know, debating something that we all would have thought was an easy, open and shut question. No, it cannot be justified. There is an absolute prohibition on torture in Britain and according to international law. And yet, we are now, in 2017, looking across the pond, across the Atlantic, to a president of the free world who claims and says not only does torture work, but he will use it. Now, he's been blocked by his intelligence chiefs and others who say that it doesn't really do our nation any good, and there are arguments as to whether it works or whether it doesn't. But one of the things I wanted to mention to you today is about the past, how the past has shaped the future we're in today. Perhaps some of you know the case and you may have heard of it. I've mentioned it many, many times before, but it's never been spoken about. Certainly Chilcot, our own report into the war in Iraq, never addressed it in any way at all. And that is, people often ask us this question, and Trump has said it, that torture works, waterboarding works. But what does it work to do? What did it do? I told you that I was held in the Bagram Detention Facility and questioned and interrogated numerous times by all of the alphabet agencies. And they said to me that if you don't cooperate with us, we will do to you what we did to a man called Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who was at that time said to be the most senior member of Al-Qaeda, captured at that point in 2001. Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi was sent alive in a coffin to a United States military ship, a naval ship in the Persian Gulf called the USS Bataan. He remained there, and after being held there for a while, he was sent to Egypt, where he was tortured directly under Omar Suleiman, who was the intelligence chief of the former President Hosni Mubarak. And there, under torture, using various methods of torture that have almost been mastered by the Egyptian regime, he gave a confession that he, as a member of Al-Qaeda, first falsehood, was working on obtaining weapons of mass destruction from Saddam Hussein, second falsehood. That information was taken by the CIA, presented to Colin Powell, who was the United States Secretary of State at the time, and then presented to the United Nations Security Council to argue for a case of war in Iraq. The invasion as a result of that took place. So if you want to know what torture achieves false confessions. Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi was never sent to Guantanamo, because in Guantanamo, though it is one of the most visible places in the war on terror, it's certainly not the worst. And there he would have got some kind of legal representation at some point. Some reporter from the Associated Press or from the New York Times or from the BBC would at some point brought his story out and said, this is what we did to this guy. We invaded Iraq as a result of what we did to him. And it turned out that the intelligence was false. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There was no Al-Qaeda presence in Iraq. And as we've seen, incrementally, Al-Qaeda came into Iraq and called itself Al-Qaeda in Iraq, first franchise. Prior to that, Al-Qaeda had no franchises. Now they've got more than McDonald's. And think about this, that Al-Qaeda, in the prisons of Abu Ghraib and Camp Booker and elsewhere, twisted their already twisted ideology to meet with the fallen Baathists of Saddam Hussein. And within those camps, within those detention centers and those dungeons where some of the worst abuses in the war on terror took place, they formulated the ideology based upon hatred, anger, and the dismemberment of Iraq. and the loss of any authority that existed there. In fact, in one of the places, in Camp Booker, there was a camp called Camp Caliphate. It was nicknamed Camp Caliphate, under American auspices. So it was already brooding. And then eventually, when the Arab Spring came, you know that the organization changed its name to Islamic State in Iraq, and then Islamic State in Sham, and then eventually Islamic State. 17 of the leaders of IS, 17 of Islamic State's leaders were held in Camps Booker and Abu Ghraib. So you have to ask yourself this question, and Obama said it just before he left his presidency, that we tortured some folk. And ISIS, was an unintended consequence of our actions. Now it's circular, think about this, from everything that we carried out, whether it was Guantanamo at the most extreme scale, to the prevent strategy that we have today, that is a legal duty binding upon our schools, colleges, universities, prisons, and beyond, where a person is deemed to be a radical or an extremist by their teacher or by their lecturer or by their doctor or by their prison officer based upon some telltale signs. And one of those telltale signs is some kind of grievance with foreign policy, a refusal to accept British values, irony upon irony. David Cameron came to a school in Birmingham where my child goes in 2015, and he gave his benchmark speech on extremism. He said that anybody who fails to adhere to British values, which include the rule of law and a respect for democracy and mutual respect and a tolerance of other faiths and beliefs, anybody who refuses to accept those is an extremist. The irony was this: my son, who goes to that school, was born while I was in Guantanamo. He was born while I was being beaten and tortured and watching people beaten to death in front of my eyes. He was born while British intelligence agents were interrogating me. And I'd been held without charge or trial in the land of Magna Carta. You know, clause 39, to no man shall justice be delayed or denied except that they be judged by a court of their peers. So where was the rule of law then? And so you see, from that point till now where we've got to, I argue and say that torture has got us this far. This is what torture has brought to us. And it's brought us in a place we've never been before. Think about this. We're told daily, even now in this week, that the terrorism threat, primarily from the Muslim community, is greater than it's ever been and is as big as it was at the height of the IRA campaign. Now, bear this in mind. At the height of the IRA campaign, 3,000 people had been killed in that conflict. 3,000. They had hit 10 Downing Street with a mortar rocket. They hit the MI5 building with an improvised explosive grenade. They bombed Warrington and Guildford and Birmingham and Harrods. They hit the Old Bailey itself where the trials were taking place. They hit Enniskillen in 1998. A dissident IRA group carried out a bombing which killed 28 people. And they're telling us that the threat from the British Muslim community is greater than it's ever been at the time of the height of the IRA. Now, not to suggest or to lessen any of the impacts of what took place in Paris, in Nice, in Brussels or beyond. But the question really has to be this: that Britain has more anti-terror legislation now than it even had at the time of the IRA. You never had anybody convicted for writing poetry. In 2008, a girl called Samina Malik was convicted under the Glorification of Terrorism Act for writing poetry in the land of Shakespeare and Wordsworth and Tennyson. Probably a lot of you people don't know about that because out of sight, out of mind. But we've had almost every year a new piece of anti-terror legislation passed in this country since the beginning, in fact, before the war on terror began. And many people who are senior politicians, senior policemen, senior clergy, have said that we fear that Britain is sleepwalking, and sometimes not even openly walking into becoming a police state. Now, some of these questions and matters and issues are beyond me. I don't have all the answers to radicalism and extremism and torture, and I don't have all the answers. What I do know is that there is a way. There is a way out, but it requires some kind of an understanding, a communication with people which is thus far been unexplored. It's something that I try to do often. I try to do it with my organization, CAGE, where we campaign for people detained without charge or trial, but we also engage with our interrogators. We engage with our guardsmen, the people who held us. So I just want to finish with a little story so we're not ending up on a note that seems completely gloomy and not positive. In fact, the last time I was in this room, I spoke alongside a captain of the US military who was in Guantanamo. His name was Captain James Yee. He was a Muslim chaplain who was working as a US military soldier in Guantanamo. And he himself was detained and arrested and charged for some kind of law in relation to treason, for showing sympathy towards the Guantanamo prisoners, for complaining about our treatment. And eventually he was put in a US military brig. He was exonerated after a few months in prison, and then he came out and started speaking out against the war and against what he'd witnessed in Guantanamo. That was right in this room here. But, you know, they say that to keep a man down, you have to stay with him. And I just think about, you know, judo or jiu-jitsu. When you put somebody down on the floor, as long as you're there with him, you can keep the person subdued. But the moment he stands up, you stand up too. And that's a lesson I learned in Guantanamo from some of my soldiers, some of the guardsmen, in solitary confinement, where I'd spent about 2 years. And just a few months ago, there was a release of a film that the BBC made about me called The Confession. And at the screening in Birmingham, there was a man I'd invited. And this man was, you know, he was a soldier from Rhode Island in America. And he'd guarded me in Camp Echo, which was a very difficult place for me to be in solitary confinement. There were no lights, there were no windows, there were no access to any communication, any meaningful communication with your family, no television, no radio, no newspapers, nothing. It was a life of existence, just existence, except for my own personal faith and some of the soldiers who would interact with me, and he was one of them. And he came along to Birmingham, to the screening. I'd collected him at the train station, and we embraced like old friends, because he'd been very good to me there. He helped to keep my sanity. And he met my son who was born while I was in Guantanamo. My son, who he was a part of the system that kept me from seeing him. I saw him for the first time when he was 3 years old. So he came to my house, we had dinner, he met my wife. We went to the screening together. My daughter was sitting next to him, though she didn't realize who he was. And she was crying all the way through the film. And he, American soldier, offered her something to wipe her tears with. At the end of the film, he walked down the stage, and the screen was packed out with people. And everybody stood up and started clapping, especially when we embraced. That night, I took him to my house. We had dinner again, got his bed ready, and I said to him, Albert, you are most welcome here, my friend, but I want to warn you, this time, I have the keys. And so you see, my friendship with many of these soldiers, like Albert and others, has continued, despite what, I guess on the blocks, it would be us and them. It would be us in orange suits, the US military in their khaki combat clothing. And rarely could we communicate with one another except that there would be peer pressure, either from the prisoners, why are you getting too friendly with those people? They are enemies of us, they hate us, they've destroyed our lives. Or the soldiers, who would be told, these terrorist scumbags are responsible for attacking your country. But one of the benefits, I would say, of solitary confinement is there is no peer pressure. There's nobody's pressure, there's just you and the guard. And so in that circumstance, I helped to be able to, I was fortunate, I would say, to be able to develop a communication with some of these guys that lasted a lifetime. And I hope that that is something, with all the difficulty that exists right now, with the polarization that exists, the anti-Muslim hatred that has risen, the Islamophobia that has risen, the anti-Semitism that has risen, the likes of which I think we last saw in the 30s, there is a place for hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Begg. I'll begin by asking some of my questions before passing over to students in the audience who I'm sure have plenty of questions for you. So going back to your arrest, what do you make of your arrest in February of 2002?
Do you mean Pakistan? Sorry, I've been arrested that many times I can't remember.
Yes.
That's the one. I don't refer it to as an arrest. The arrest has a connotation of police, a legal system, people showing their identification, being uniformed. That didn't happen. This was an abduction. This was a rendition. It was a kidnap. I was in my house in Islamabad in Pakistan in 2001 in February. There was a knock on my door. I opened the door to be faced by with a number of people, all of them ununiformed, without any identification. They stormed into my house, pushed me onto the forecourt of my house, onto the ground, shackled my hands behind my back, shackled my legs and put a hood over my head, picked me up physically. My wife and kids, my kids were very young at the time, caught a glimpse of that. I didn't see them. And then off they took me into the back of the vehicle. In the back of the vehicle, there were two Caucasian men dressed as local Pakistanis who spoke with American accents. It was clear in my mind they were CIA, and they said, you can either answer our questions here or in Guantanamo. And they eventually, after a couple of weeks, sent me to Kandahar, to Bagram, and then to Guantanamo. Why? Two reasons. One is that the British security services had already come to my house, asked me about the case of an individual who'd written to me from the Emirates, who had said that he'd been tortured, and could I find a lawyer for him, an international lawyer, and I did. That's how I first met my friend, my great friend and lawyer, Gareth Pearce. And also that the United States government had been flying over missions, not dropping bombs first, but dropping leaflets. I mean, literally millions of them. And Donald Rumsfeld said in almost a poetic way that they're falling like snowflakes in December in Chicago. And these leaflets, they offered a bounty of $5,000 or more for any foreign terrorism suspect, for anybody, for any foreigner that a local might think that, perhaps he's connected to something or the other. And so literally we were sold over for bounties.
So on the day of your kidnap, you became aware of your fate. Did you believe in that, or did you think that things would be more peaceful?
I'd seen images, first of all, of the Guantanamo prisoners in January, the preceding month, so I knew that it was happening. When they said Guantanamo, it came as a shock. I didn't really think they were going to do this. During my interrogations, when the British intelligence agents were physically there, I knew that that's it. My own government's cooperating in this.
Right, and then you spent some time in Bagram before heading to Guantanamo.
Yeah.
Were you aware when you were going to be sent to Guantanamo, or was that kept secret away from you?
I spent quite a long time in Bagram, I think almost 11 months, which was unusually long. Mostly people spend about 3 or so months there. I'm still not sure as to the reason why, but I almost became a part of the furniture there. I got to know the entire system, the soldiers. One of the funniest things that happened is that there's a soldier who was brought up for war crimes charges in Bagram and then later in Abu Ghraib. And his nickname was the Monster and the King of Torture. The odd thing was that he used to speak to me. He was never involved in my interrogation, but he used to speak to me as he'd go past my cell, and he seemed like a really nice, decent kind of guy. He gave me a book, which I still have to this day. It's Catch-22, the ultimate anti-war novel. And he gave it to me, but after I was released, his lawyers sent me a message asking if I'd be willing to be a character witness in his case because he'd been brought up for war crimes charges, which I found really, really bizarre. But those are the sorts of things that were happening in Bagram. I saw 2 people beaten to death with their hands tied above their heads, and literally being kicked and punched till they didn't move. And I was subjected to an interrogation over a period of time where the sounds of a woman screaming were in the next room, which I was led to believe was my wife being tortured, while my children's pictures were being waved in front of me. And so I guess by the time they told me I'm going to Guantanamo, I said, where do I sign? You know, people think it's an odd thing to say, but I was actually looking forward to going to Guantanamo.
How did the experiences compare?
Most of my time, as I said, was spent in Guantanamo in solitary confinement. So Bagram was quite hostile. You weren't allowed to walk or talk or to even look at the soldiers. We didn't wash. We didn't have any washing facilities. You were given one plastic bottle a day to drink water from. There were no hot meals, no fruit, no veg. It was just these military ration packs. So a year of that was you know, a person could become suicidal. In comparison, I had 3 paces that I could take forward and back in a solitary confinement cell in Guantanamo. There was no window, there was no access to natural light, but at least there was a soldier on the other side. And every 3 months or so, or 4 months or so, I'd receive a letter through the Red Cross from my children, though sometimes they'd be heavily redacted, so a 6-year-old would have written, my daughter once wrote this poem, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, once I caught a fish alive. Some hack, I guess, in the US censorship thought that that's some kind of a code and blocked it all out. So that's the sort of stuff that was going on there. But still, I say it was better than Bagram.
But Guantanamo is sort of notorious for its psychological impact that it has.
Sure.
How did it impact you directly?
The only time in my life ever up until that point I'd ever met with a psychiatrist or with a psychologist was in Guantanamo. Once I was pacing up and down in my cell, 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, and I lost it. I started screaming and crying and punching and kicking and spitting and swearing at the soldiers, something I would never do. I would never do something like that, but I just lost my control. So they sent me over a psychiatrist. And this psychiatrist sat over the other side of the cell and said, have you ever contemplated removing your trousers and threading them with a sheet, tying it around your neck to make a noose, and then attaching it to the corner of the cell and then jumping off? So I don't know whether that was psychological operations, which she was trying to test me with something. But I do know that, you know, several months later, 3 people are allegedly purported to have committed suicide by that method.
And in terms of you walking up and down your cell, what were you allowed to do, and sort of what happened during these months in prison?
You're allowed to do anything that you can do within the space of that cell. They don't control you in the cell. The cell itself is a controlled space. So I had access to limited books. I had access to a pen, which is about 2 inches high. Anything bigger than that would have constituted a weapon. And it was made of rubber, so it couldn't be hardened or used as a threat towards anyone. I wrote poetry. I wrote letters, knowing that they would probably arrive 6 months or a year after I'd written them, or not at all. I wrote lists of words. I tried to remember every language I'd studied, from the Jewish school that I went to as a child, from Hebrew, from the Arabic that I studied, from whatever it was, just lists of things, lists of books that I'd read or wanted to read, just to keep my mind aware. And of course, as a Muslim, memorize the Quran and try to understand its meanings that I felt were relevant to me now.
And you swallowed there to keep my mind away. What was actually going through your mind?
Family, primarily. I knew that I had a child born that I hadn't seen, and years had already passed. My other younger children, my eldest daughter probably broke my heart the most, because they were her birthdays. I remembered them and how I used to spend those birthdays with her. I remember one particular occasion when there was an interrogation taking place. One of the interrogators told me, I'm going off today because it's my daughter's birthday. That was my daughter's birthday. So those sorts of things. A person in that sort of situation, if he contemplates on his family and his life too long, he will go mad. So you have to tell yourself, you're not a father, you're not a husband, you're not a son, you're just a number, and I was 5'8".
And you mentioned that you were writing quite a lot. Were you scared that everything that you wrote would be censored.
Yeah,
and seen.
yeah. Well, sometimes I would write letters knowing, I'd write the letters not expecting them to go anywhere except to the censors. So I was indirectly writing to the American military and giving them little messages. I don't know whether they worked or not, but I understood that a lot of what I'm saying is going to get redacted before it gets home, if it gets home.
What's that? Were you writing about justice?
I'd written about the deaths I'd seen. I'd written about the fact that I'd been held without charge or trial by America, which purports to understand the role of habeas corpus, the right to the body. I wrote about the cruelty and the torture that I'd witnessed. And I wrote about some of the decent things that I'd seen too, about the decent guards and soldiers.
And you mentioned the interrogation techniques in Bagram and just now about in Guantanamo. How did they differ? And what had a bigger impact on you? I
think Guantanamo was less adversarial. In Bagram, by its very nature, because it was in Afghanistan was a war zone. You'd hear often landmines going off, shells being fired, bullets being fired. So the response of interrogators and soldiers was always much harsher. As I said, I saw people being physically beaten to death, and worse, people brought in wounded. There was a young Canadian boy who was brought in at the age of 14 years old. His case is very well known in Canada. His name is Omar Khadr. He was brought in with his eye shot out and 2 huge exit wounds from his chest, from his shoulder and from his chest that just missed his heart. And the number of people, local Afghans and so forth, being brought in, wounded, old people who were denied their walking sticks or their hearing aids because they could be used as some sort of a security infraction. All of that was happening. That didn't happen in Guantanamo. Guantanamo was a lot more psychologically driven to in my view, slowly break down the prisoners as opposed to physically.
And then you're finally released without charge. Have you figured out what the biggest purpose of your detention was?
Yeah, I have. The British intelligence services. I was told as much by the Americans. They had no interest. You know, I've never been to America. America has been to me, as it were. And the only people who were involved in this, and I fought a strong case against the British intelligence services for being complicit. I mean, there was a particular individual who came to my house, sat in the house in 1999, the same person I spoke to you of. Let's call him Andrew, that's what he called himself. And he was amenable, we spoke several times, and the next time I saw him after that was when I'm hooded and shackled on my knees with my hands behind my back and guns pointed towards my head. The hood lifts off and there's Andrew, the same guy who used to sit in my front room or had come to my front room and been given tea. So there was no getting around that. There was no getting around the fact that my own government and individuals who are part of it have been the key reason that I was held in Guantanamo. And it was based, I think, on a confused understanding of who I was. And I think those mistakes were made in the past and they're being made currently, even as we speak.
Does it make it difficult to live in this country?
No, I was born and raised here. As you can see, you know, I think I sound as English as the next person. Funny enough, the Americans used to ask me, what's the best thing about England? And I'd say sarcastically, Scotland and Wales. But you know, to me, it's you know, I go to holiday regularly in Wales. I'm as British as you can get. Even if now people ask, are you Muslim or are you British? Which is, you know, the two are not mutually exclusive. But that's the kind of world we live in. It's hard to see a country that I've loved change so much. In that sense, your question is it hard to be here now? In that sense, it's hard, yeah.
And you mentioned British values in your speech. Do they exist?
I'm still to know what they are. I really want to know what British values are. If it is about the rule of law, then I have yet to see it. I have yet to see the application of the rule of law. Torture is a war crime. Just think about this. Donald Trump said that I will use waterboarding. Now, waterboarding has nothing to do with surfing. Waterboarding it was first used during the Spanish Inquisition. It's called tortura del agua. It's torture of the water. A person is placed on a bench, and their hands, legs, and arms are tied down, and water is poured over their noses, and they feel that they're drowning even though they're not submerged. Japanese soldiers who waterboarded American POWs during World War II were prosecuted and executed for war crimes. So how is it possible now that at least 5 people, 4 or 5 people were waterboarded during the war on terror? Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Abdurrahim al-Nashiri, Abu Zubaydah, all of these individuals were waterboarded hundreds of times. And again, as I said to you before, that we tortured people, and as a result of that tortured intelligence, we invaded a country and set the entire world ablaze as a result of it. So I don't know how any of this can make any sense to me.
And you mentioned President Trump and his appraisal, let's say, of waterboarding. Do you not think that in some ways that will question the use of torture within the international community?
I think, let's put the scenario this way. Imagine the country I'm named after, Mozambique. I'm not, just... But imagine Mozambique declared, or imagine Zimbabwe, Mugabe declared, that I will use waterboarding because I think it works. I think torture works. And I will use it against any person who I think destabilizes my country, who happens to be anybody from the West, a white Westerner. And I will use it against them in any case of national security because I think it works. What would be the international community's response? Sanctions at best, at least, and perhaps bombing them into a bit more democracy might also be on the table. So I think the problem isn't what Trump says. Trump has said what he believes in and has tried to follow through with many of those things. The problem is our response to it. How do we as a nation deal with a country with a leader that openly calls for torture and says torture works when there is an absolute prohibition against it in international law?
And if the citizens of this country reject torture altogether as a community, what do you think the best response to protect the security of the country is?
Well, as I said, we've got to go back to history didn't begin at 9/11. As I said, growing up as a youth in Birmingham, it wasn't the Muslims who were the terrorist community. We weren't called terrorists. We weren't called extremists. It was the Irish. The Irish were called terrorists. And the laws and measures that they have, I've been to Derry a few times and sat with survivors of the Bloody Sunday massacre. Bloody Sunday only happened because 25,000 people were protesting against internment, which was happening in Britain. People were being detained without charge or trial. When those people were executed, literally, or shot dead on their own streets in Derry, the IRA had its greatest recruiting sergeant. So here's a simple equation. Don't torture, don't invade countries, understand policy, make people feel welcome, like they're part of society. Don't alienate them, don't tell them that they're fifth columns. And perhaps that kind of fear and alienation won't exist that leads to the radicalization, but something else is happening now too. Because we've been talking thus far about Islamic extremism. In Quebec, just a few weeks ago, a supporter of Donald Trump walked into a mosque and shot 6 people as they prayed. An elected member of the British Parliament, Joe Cox, who cared deeply about issues pertaining to Syria and refugees and migrants, was chopped down in the streets by somebody who shouted Britain first from the far right. So pushing so far the narrative that says that these foreigners, these Muslims and whoever need to be tackled has created a problem the likes of which we've never seen before. And I think if we want to tackle the security problem, we need to fully accept our role in destabilizing the world.
And I understand that you're not best friends with members of this government, and Boris Johnson.
I have tea with some of them.
Well, and Foreign Secretary has in fact, clashed with Cage, the organisation that you lead. But if you were to advise Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister, on how to make young Muslims feel welcome in this country, what would your advice to be?
Rein in the media. That would be the first thing. You know, I was just looking on the way here. You know, we've been told that the threat by ISIS is the greatest, and they've done no attacks. But ISIS has actually carried out an attack on British soil. And most people have completely disregarded it. There were no newspapers leading the front page. There was a man, an imam, called Jalaluddin from Rochdale, who was killed last year by an ISIS supporter called Mohammed Saeed and his friend Abdul Qadir. And they were entirely and utterly supporters of ISIS and had actually gone over to Syria. And they butchered this man in the street because he was of a different Islamic persuasion than them, and they believed him to be a heretic, and they killed him. But there was no front page led with this story at all. There was no Cobra meetings or no statement issued by the Prime Minister. So, you know, there is a lopsided view of how we're viewing terrorism. So I would advise the Prime Minister to recognize that make people feel like they're equal and like they belong. And it's not just the politicians. You know, there was a friend of mine, there was an imam who I did a talk with in a mosque that was jam-packed with young Muslim youth. The talk was entitled "The Evils of ISIS." I spoke about it to a great degree from my own time in Syria. That same imam who spoke alongside with me, warning the youth not to join ISIS, was named by the Prime Minister falsely as a supporter of IS. And when the Prime Minister was questioned about it, because this individual had been connected to Sadiq Khan, the mayor, and it was during the mayoral candidacy when there was a lot of mud-singing happening. But in the midst of it, this poor innocent imam who'd been trying to counter IS with his own narrative was singled out by the Prime Minister, who hid behind parliamentary privilege and said, this guy's a supporter of IS. And when he was quizzed on it, he said, oh no, I mean, what I meant was he's a supporter of an Islamic State, but not the Islamic State. What does that mean? Saudi Arabia is an Islamic State. That means you support them as a Prime Minister. We lowered our flag half-mast when King Abdullah died. So it makes no sense. So this sort of thing isn't just being peddled by the media, by the tabloid media, but it's also being peddled by some of the politicians at the very top of government. And so they need to be challenged.
So let me ask you a question that I'm sure the Prime Minister gets asked. Is ISIS the biggest threat to the security of this country?
No. Simple answer is no. We are the Brits. Generally, Brits are really good at queuing up. But when it comes to ISIS and terrorism, we always like to jump the queue. Go and ask Saudi Arabia. Go and ask Tunisia or Jordan or Turkey or the host of Muslim countries that have been plagued by ISIS, where the majority of ISIS fighters come from Saudi Arabia and Tunisia and Libya. Why does Britain place itself ahead of that queue? Britain has the amount of cities that have been targeted by IS in the Muslim world is you know, I think they've killed about 120,000 people in total. I think that's the number. Maybe I've got the figures wrong. We've had, according to the statistics here, if you take the one that I gave you that's not been accepted widely, we've had no attacks by ISIS. Now the security services will say we've thwarted many attacks, and you know, good on them for doing that. But it's how do you explain to ordinary people who are told day in and day out that ISIS is knocking on your door? ISIS is knocking on your door. ISIS is in Iraq fighting for survival. You know, they are more concerned with what's happening in Mosul and Raqqa and Dabiq than they are concerned with what's happening in Oxford. The threat does exist, there's no doubt about that. But I think we have to seriously bear in mind and recognize, as I said to you before, Britain has had experience of terrorism. We've dealt with it the right way and the wrong way. The wrong way was to introduce internment, was to demonize people and to alienate them. The right way was negotiation, and that's why you have at the end of all of that, Martin McGuinness, the leader of the IRA, shaking hands with the Queen.
So do you believe that there is a problem of Islam-led terrorism in this country?
There's a problem of terrorism within the Muslim community to some degree, as there is within the broader community. There is nobody expected, for example, Anders Breivik to go and kill 70 odd people in the name of whatever his ideology was, but it happened. But I'll tell you this, if Muslims were the greatest threat that we're constantly told, we are 1.6 billion of the world's populace. That's a big problem. And either we're the world's worst terrorists, because we haven't really, even in this country, there are about 3 to 4 million Muslims. Most of us are peaceful. Most of us want to live in society like everywhere else. To tarnish us with the same brush is to tarnish the entire host community with the crimes of the majority, which are carried out by white males.
But do you not think that this is a result of the media's interaction with the Muslim community in the UK and abroad? The government does try to identify ISIS as opposed to, the Muslim community as a place of danger.
No, the government has done far more than just ISIS. If it was just about ISIS, I'd accept that. But ISIS only came onto the scene in 2014. Baroness Warsi, who was part of the government in 2013, actually said, she was the co-chair of the Conservative Party. She said that Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred, has passed the dinner table test. And that essentially means you can sit down around dinner table, talk about EastEnders, Coronation Street, football, and how bad Muslims are. So this has nothing to do with ISIS. This is, as I said, it's been going on right from the outset of the war on terror.
My last question to you. You clearly criticise MI5 and MI6 and the British government. Which one would you criticise more and why?
They're all part of the same thing. The MI5 is the security arm of the government. They are essentially report back to people within the government. So if there's anybody in charge, ultimately it goes to them. But what we can't do, and I'm not saying that MI5 agents are anywhere near as bad in any way. I understand they're doing their job and they need to do their job, and I support them in doing their job. But to argue that I was just doing my job was one of the arguments that was refused and not recognized at the Nazi war crime tribunals in Nuremberg.
Right. Well, I will now let students ask their questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to be brought to you. First question will go to the member in the first row in a beige jacket.
Moazzam, thank you first of all so much for coming. As a fellow Muslim and a fellow Brummy as well, found a lot of what you said.
No one's perfect.
No one's perfect. Found a lot of what you said extremely interesting, and I hope you'll indulge my rather long-winded question. I went to school in Edgbaston where we had an extremely diverse, extremely tolerant set of students and teachers. And I remember there was a talk by the Quilliam Foundation, which I think is led by Majid Nawaz. And they were talking about Islamic extremism. And I remember being sat down with loads of my incredibly intelligent colleagues. And they were asking questions like, don't you think mosques should be doing more? Don't they have the greatest power to stop this terrorism? Isn't the responsibility on Muslims? You were asked a question just 5 minutes ago by the speaker: is Islam-led terrorism a problem that the UK faces? And people talk about this threat of ISIS when, as you said yourself, ISIS is slaughtering Shia Muslims, Yazidi Muslims in Iraq in the hundreds of thousands. I went to Iraq a couple of months ago to visit some family there. They are terrified of ISIS. They despise ISIS far more than you could even imagine. And yet there is this disconnect. People associate, like I said, that question just illustrated to me so much. People associate Islam with this brand of terrorism. For them, it's inextricably linked. As Muslims, what do you think we can do to demolish that image? I mean, my sister's doing Arabic at SOAS. She's prime material to be recruited into MI5. What should we be doing? What should we be saying? Is there anything that we can do or can do better to remove this image of Muslims in the UK, which I think, as you so brilliantly illustrated, is actually, if anything, driving people towards radicalisation?
Wonderful question. As I said before, I don't know all the answers. What more can we be doing? I think as a community, I've never seen us bend over so much, bend over backwards so much to try to accommodate and to allay the fears of local population. I say this from being within the community, knowing how people speak, and sometimes it's to the point of you feel, oh my God, is he going to apologize again for something that he doesn't believe in, something that he's not connected to, something that he's never seen, something that he's not part of, yet he's still apologizing for it. I mean, that disempowers the community. If that is the way we deal with any kind of criminality, then who's going to apologize for pedophilia? Who's going to apologize for kidnap? Who's going to apologize for murder? I mean, statistically speaking, more people are killed by car crashes in this country than ever they are by terrorism. But, you know, I'll just give you an example. You know, people have asked the mosques, what can the mosques do? The mosque is the last place any radicalized youth will ever go, because most of the mosques are governed by the Charities Commission, and the Charities Commission has come down hard on every Muslim charity. And so to even have the inkling of the idea of a discussion about terrorism or ISIS or political disenfranchisement, it can't happen. You are more likely, and I've taken part in debates and discussions in churches more often than I have in mosques on issues pertaining to Islamophobia and terrorism and extremism. I mean, literally, I remember I spoke at one of the largest cities in this country, up in the north, and the conference on extremism and Islamophobia took place in a church next to the biggest mosque in that city. The mosque was completely oblivious of it. They were too afraid to take part. So disempowering, frightening, and self-censoring ourselves, it causes us to not even address the subject. I said, you know, we had that discussion called the evils of ISIS. You know, the Daily Telegraph got a hold of these guys are talking about ISIS. What's your real view of ISIS? What do you know, you've said to people that the Syrian revolution is something that, you know, is something that was good. It began as something that was good. What do you mean? Do you support revolution? And so the very nature of how we're interrogated has most people on the back foot. So you say, okay, next time, the mosque said, we will never have an event like this again, evils of ISIS or not. So I'm afraid we're on a very uphill struggle.
Next question, can we go to the first row over here?
Thank you. Hi. Do you believe in a role of Islam in government and politics?
In government and politics, here in Britain?
Hypothetically, in any nation?
There is. In every Islamic country, there is. You know, Pakistan calls itself the Islamic Republic of Iran, of Pakistan, sorry. Iran calls itself the Islamic Republic. Mauritania calls itself the Islamic Republic. In terms of domestic and social law that's applied, for example, in Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Qatar, they all have aspects of Islamic law that are part of their constitution, so they do already exist.
Great. Next question, can we go to the third row on the aisle? Yeah.
What do you think would have been an appropriate reaction of the Western world to Donald Trump threatening to use waterboarding?
I think I addressed that, but it just suggests to me that Donald Trump has come from a place where he feels that it's okay to say waterboarding is a viable option in fighting terrorism. And I'll tell you why. Because a precedent was not set from the previous government. So just understand this a little. When Bush came into power, he, after 9/11, began a program that was entitled Enhanced Interrogation Techniques. That was the cover for torture. He never called it torture. His legal advisors said for something to constitute torture, unless it's organ failure or death, it's not torture. It's enhanced interrogation techniques. So Bush never said that torture works, as draconian as he may have seemed to be. When Obama came into power, he said, I will stop torture. I'll end Guantanamo and I'll end the renditions program. But he also said that there will be immunity for any of the CIA agents who carried out torture against Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Abu Zubaydah and all the other guys. So essentially, he said, people who carried out these war crimes will be protected and immune from prosecution. Had they been prosecuted, there is absolutely no way on God's earth that Trump would have said, I believe torture works, because then he would have been subject to some kind of prosecution himself. There had been a precedent.
Great. Next question. Can we go to the first row here? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking. This is taking a little bit of a different angle, but I was at an exhibition last year, in September of last year, and it was about the war on terror, mainly focusing on Europe. And there was a lot about control order houses in the UK. And I was so shocked to find out about them. I didn't know anything about them at all. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how black spots that we associate with things like extraordinary renditions, like that ship, like Guantanamo, are actually very much located within the British judicial architecture.
Okay, that's a really good question. The exhibition you're talking about is at the Imperial War Museum, and it's done by a guy called Ed Clark. What he did is photograph space. He actually did a book upon the Guantanamo prisoners first, on their and it was he took. Most people want to take pictures of our faces. He wanted to take pictures of everything but our faces. So it was all the space that was around us and where we lived and how we lived. So he did this in relation to people who were placed on control orders. Now, I said to you that there have been a new piece of anti-terror legislation passed in this country every year since 2000. And one of the laws that were passed in 2001 was an emergency law after 9/11 that called for the detention of 16 Middle Eastern and North African men. And they were held in Belmarsh top security prison without charge or trial in Britain, in Belmarsh, not Guantanamo. So that was already happening here. The House of Lords ruled in their case that their detention had been unconstitutional, i.e. illegal, and they were released. Shortly after the July the 7th bombings, which these guys had no connection to at all, these same individuals and some more were placed under control orders, something known as and a new law passed that applied control orders, which control orders essentially was a type of house arrest in Britain, again, not Burma. And the rules that existed, the conditions that existed around a person, first of all, they were placed on this control order based upon secret evidence at a court called SIAC, the Special Immigration and Appeals Commissions. And they themselves or their lawyers couldn't challenge because they couldn't see the evidence. It was deemed to be national security. And they were placed under measures which included them, in some cases, being internally exiled. That means, say they lived in Oxford and had lived here all their lives. They were now unceremoniously taken over to Liverpool and placed in a little town there, away from their families. Those who were with their families were not allowed visits by anyone except that they had to be cleared by the Home Office. That included children who wanted to come over to visit the friends of and so forth. Phone calls they couldn't make. They couldn't have mobile phones. They had to come home within curfew times, and they couldn't go outside a certain radius. Aspects of that were again found to be unconstitutional in 2011, which especially the internal exile. But the effects we dealt with in my organization, a lot of the effects, the debilitating effects on individuals' lives, and some of them, their children would say, we would prefer it when our father was in prison, because when he's at home, all those measures, they apply to us. So again, yeah, that's another part of the legal process in this country that's been used to tackle terrorism, that is actually fed into the narrative that this is just against Muslims, because the only people placed on control orders were Muslims.
Good. One more question. Yes, second row here.
Thank you for your talk. I want to know what your opinion is about the media's portraying of incidents regarding Muslims and those of other faiths. So if a Muslim does something, then it's terrorism, whereas if persons of other faith do it, then they're lone wolves and acting on their own.
John Humphreys on Radio 4 recently was speaking to one of the police commissioners about a report which highlighted the terror threat that I was referring to. In the discussion, the police officer, to his credit, said that there are threats also from other types of terrorism, which include the rise of the far-right terrorism, and he cited the killing of Joe Cox MP. John Humphreys, who's I guess a national figure, responded by saying, but wasn't he a lone wolf? Wasn't this guy just a psychologically unstable person who was carrying out an act of murder? The police officer, who knew his stuff, responded by saying, the court thought otherwise. He was convicted as a terrorist. Our media didn't jump up and down about it in the way that they did or would have had it been somebody else. I know from my city in Birmingham, there was a man called Mohammed Saeed who was coming back from the mosque early in the early hours a few years ago, and he was stabbed by a white supremacist who was from Eastern Europe, and he was killed. He was murdered. It happened around the similar time of the brutal killing of drummer Lee Rigby by Michael Adebolajo. Everybody knows Lee Rigby's story. Hardly anyone knows Mohammed Saeed's story. And they're the obvious discrepancies that you find in how people talk about terrorism that exists. If you look at the statistics, to be honest with you, I know the terrible attacks that happened, the mass attacks that happened in Paris and Brussels and Nice remain in people's minds, and rightly so. But if you look at the statistics just in 2014 alone, it said before those attacks that this is a Europol statistics, that's the European Police Agency, 99.7% attacks of terrorist attacks carried out in Europe were done by people who were not Muslim, i.e. 0.3%. That's a Europol statistic. I know that the recent attacks from ISIS changed that, I get that, but it does show that how come up until that point we had the concentration on the 0.3%. What about the 99.7%?
Thank you, Mr. Begg. I think on this note, it is over. We have time for this evening. Please can I ask you all to remain in your seats, but before doing this, I would like to thank Mr. Begg for coming this evening and delivering his speech of the Oxford Union. Thank you.
Thank you.